Welcome to the House Rules, the gaming compliance podcast from the Association of Certified Gaming Compliance Specialists. In this podcast, we will hear from casino and iGaming compliance specialists, discussing the latest trends and hot topics impacting the industry. We will also be focusing on careers in compliance, hearing from seasoned professionals about their own career paths and sharing their expertise and insights. In this episode, join Thomas Mangine, Director AML and Risk Resilience at BMO, for a discussion on the various considerations, impacts, and implications that sports betting presents for financial institutions.
I think the important thing, most of this briefing is set up from the perspective of the financial industry for people in it to learn how to organize their thoughts. But I wasn't sure how many people we would have coming from the actual gaming sports betting industry. So I tried to include some nuggets in there that are relevant to you in your own anti-money laundering, fraud, and risk programs, as well as having a conversation with financial institutions, payment service providers. I did have the unique pleasure of attending the SBC Gaming Conference in Barcelona 2 weeks ago, which helped refine this. I'm going to start off talking a little bit about my background because I think it'll explain some things as we go forward. It'll start to make sense in my particular approach. So I've been working in the financial industry for 8 years. Prior to that, I was a U.S. Army officer, and I served in the United States Department of Defense for over 2 decades. That framed the way that I approach a lot of challenges out there. This will make sense to you as you go forward. I started off in a traditional position in infantry, but after September 11th, I moved into the larger special operations community where I gained an appreciation for following the money and really doing internet searches of what we now call open source information, OSINT, and seeing how much information people laid bare for everyone to see. This started off with following terrorist networks about 20 years ago. But what you start to recognize very quickly if you're working in terrorist financing is that there's tremendous confluence or overlap between transnational criminal organizations that are smuggling drugs, smuggling weapons of mass destruction, or smuggling advanced technology for weapons, and traditional terrorists. And they start to leverage the same techniques for hiding or attempting to hide their activities, attempting to become anonymous online or in person. They tend to use the same document forgery. So I had the unique experience of spending more than 2/3 of my career overseas and working on 6 continents. And what you start to understand is that there are general patterns of behavior that follow everyone's conduct. And if you can gain an appreciation for that, you'll be a lot more effective in these activities. So that's the way that I organize my thoughts and my approaches as I bring it forward. As we get into the meat of the discussion, if you do have questions, please bring it up in the chat. And Ian, if I'm missing questions that are out there, because I am a little bit technologically challenged, as you can see in the gray in my beard, some of this is a little bit of an issue for me. Please let me know about what's out there. The focus of this discussion is for everyone to get something out of it. So if your questions aren't answered, Ian and I are not doing what you signed up to do today. That being said, we will make these slides available to everyone. If you've got questions that we don't get to in the discussion, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. In the slide deck itself, in the notes section, there's some links to some useful pieces of information, some videos that I've referenced in the production of this presentation. There's also a copy of my email. So feel free to reach out and ask questions. That's one of the jobs that I do at the bank. My job is threefold. I have 3 primary tasks. One is to do targeted and enhanced due diligence investigation. Those are the due diligence investigations on the more complicated issues, with an emphasis at looking at emerging problems or emerging trends. Well, I was looking at problems with Russian money laundering going through Scandinavia in 2015 and 2016. And the reason why my bank focuses on that is, when did Noah build the ark? Before the flood. And therein lie the difference. The quicker that you can identify potential risk concerns, the sooner you can engage with the rest of your colleagues at a financial institution and the client to address them. And that's how you avoid most of the problems. If there is a real serious issue, you're reporting on it earlier and you're getting ahead of the curve and engaging with authorities. It'll make the situation better. If there's a misunderstanding or only a potential issue, you resolve that quickly. One of the things that I see in the private sector, which I entered in 2014, is that we've engaged compliance people very often at the end of discussion, where everybody's already invested a lot of work and somebody comes in and starts criticizing where we've gone and requesting changes. That's not a good way to get on people's good side. The second thing that I do is engage with government sectors and some of our partners out there, whether they're clients or correspondent banks, get an assessment of emerging trends in money laundering and terrorist financing and incorporate that into our approach. And the third factor is internal training. In addition to being a member of Bank of Montreal, I'm also an adjunct professor at the Joint Special Operations University. It's part of the National Defense University, a credit university operated by the U.S. Department of Defense. I teach classes on money laundering, terrorist financing, and cyber-enabled financial crime. And I'll be teaching some new classes on orientation to virtual currency and virtual. So without any further ado, we'll get started with the course today, or the presentation today, which is sports betting. What I'm trying to get everyone in the financial industry to gain a greater appreciation for is how diverse the spectrum is within sports betting. The thing that distinguishes Canada and the United States from a lot of other countries in the world is we're several decades behind what they've been doing. Legalized single event sporting event, sports event betting is relatively new compared to what you had in Asia and in Europe. So there is a tremendous lack of appreciation for the different elements of this sector and where people are taking the market and where they're looking to get clients in the future. And if you don't understand that, you're not going to be very good at assessing risk and preventing criminal activity or preventing criminals from exploiting what's going on. So what you see out there are just some basic orientations to sports line that you see in a casino, some of the sports betting rooms that you see in casinos and other companies in the top left corner, the phone applications, the online applications that are being brought out to everyone to allow people from around the world to bet on single sports events from other countries. So sports betting in American football, we'll have people betting on the game that are enthusiasts around the world, other people that think that they have inside information and that they can generate a certain amount of profit because they think that one team is going to beat the odds or beat the spread and win on that game. This is the agenda that we'll follow. We'll talk a little bit about just getting started, understanding the environment, what I refer to often as the operational environment. That's the space in which we're operating, which is sports betting, which is part of the gaming industry, and it's part of the overall financial industry. And so you need to take those factors into consideration. We'll get into some more specific risk considerations in developing your strategy for getting into this field or operating effectively in this field. And then we'll bring up the critical considerations for a number of different folks, whether you're in the financial industry, the gaming industry. And I'll leave some time, hopefully at the end, to get more into questions as they come up. But feel free to shoot your question in the chat. If it's up there, we'll try and address it as it goes forward. So we'll start off with something here, and this is the hit home a principle that I call crime follows cop. There aren't a lot of criminals out there working with BCR because it's a dying industry. This relates to COVID-19. And why is this important? Take a look at what's circled in red. This is the first COVID-19 related prosecution in the United States. The date on that is March 22nd. So if you weren't living in North America at that time, COVID was understood as some sort of virus that was in the People's Republic, that was starting to spread in Asia in late January and early February. And then it was declared a pandemic. But the concerns weren't really growing here in the United States until the last couple of days of February, early March. And then in the middle of March, then President Trump started banning flights to Asia and to Europe and made plans to evacuate some American citizens who wanted to become repatriated to the United States. What you're looking at here is by the third week of March, U.S. government officials had identified fraudulent activity related to COVID-19, put together a case, indicted people, prosecuted them, and got the conviction by the third week of March. And that's to get you to understand how fast criminals move in this space. So when we look at the US sports betting market, this is the best graph I could see it. Criminal elements recognize the amount of money that's moving. You see the first 2 years, 2020 and 2021, that's data that we already have in hand. I'll take one example. The state of Arizona in the southwest of the United States legalized single event sports betting just over a year ago. Their first report of their first year returns on sports betting is $5 billion. So you see about a 6 or 7% increase from 2020 to 2021 in the United States. We're going to see even greater growth going into 2022 and going forward. This is an accurate projection. If we can see this on some website or on some media site, then certainly criminals understand this, and they're already finding ways to innovate because they're already in this space, and we all need to recognize it. So as we talk about getting started, this is going to sound a little basic, but I've been a little bit surprised at how sometimes we just kind of jump into things in the private sector and even in government. I will put the emphasis on think about what you're doing and then take action, and really emphasize the thinking piece. Don't just conceive of an idea and then brief everybody on what you're doing. For a lot of people on this, I think you're already in the space. I would advise you to sit back, take a look at the legislation that continues to evolve in North America, and rethink and revise what you're doing. Have a plan for assessing the risk of existing and new clients, and then onboarding newer clients. And have a discussion internally. This last part is focused more on sports betting companies, casinos, and financial companies in the financial industry. At some point, expand this conversation about risk to include the business and sales team. Have a back and forth about what they're doing. And be very honest about what you can do right now, what you can do in the next 90 days, what you can do in 6 months or a year. Because throwing yourself wholeheartedly into the industry is how you quickly get overwhelmed and you fail to recognize problems until a regulator brings it to you. Something winds up in the newspaper, and no one wants that to happen. So as you look at your considerations, think about your overall risk appetite. Where are you right now? Think about the jurisdictions in which you will operate with sports betting. One of the most important things that I think you need to stress to people, particularly in North America, is there's a tendency for folks to say, oh, we're only going to handle sports betting in the United States. We'll only handle it in Canada because the landscape in the United States is a little too complex. That's fantastic. How are you defining Canada or the United States, especially when you bring this into the virtual space? How are you confirming that your client, Tom Mangine, who's placing bets, is actually in Illinois, where he's currently located, or he's in Florida, or he's in the province of Florida? How do you verify that? Will you allow Tom Mangine, who's gaming somewhere legally in the European Union, to make significant deposits to his longstanding bank account that I've always had with TD Bank or with RBC Bank because I was born and raised in Nova Scotia? Can you recognize it, and do you feel comfortable with it? And the more that you have these discussions up front, the better your analysis will be going forward, and the less decisions you'll have to make on the fly. As you look at your clients, there's an emphasis sometimes to only consider brick and mortar facilities and online as two distinct worlds. You've got to recognize that for years now, there's tremendous confluence between them. What do I mean about that? In the United States, there were two states that have dominated the gaming industry, New Jersey and Nevada, as single event sports betting became legal in the United States. Nevada was leaning forward in setting up rooms within brick and mortar, within traditional casinos, that would make information available about different sports lines and what the odds were. And not only bidding on the individual results of a game or a match, but how players would perform. And they've continued to innovate in that space. So you've got to understand that you may book casinos physical casinos, and you may have the intent of not being in the online, but you've got to make sure that you're having those conversations with the casinos to say, this is what we want and this is what we don't want, and understand what they're doing. Just because you don't have that part of their business going through your financial institution doesn't mean that you have risk exposure to problems in that other space that they're not banking. And we'll talk about that more in detail. Products and services that you're going to offer. You might not want to bring a sports betting company online so that people will place bets through your institution or through your payment provider, but you'll certainly take that company's overall deposit and you'll offer certain loans to them, or you'll offer banking services like multi-currency accounts. Have a discussion about what you're going to offer, and then think about what you might consider going forward. And the reason why I say that is in larger companies aren't just focused on due diligence. If you're in a sports betting company, if you're in a casino, if you're in a financial institution, you might be prepared to handle one element of the industry. You might be able to, or might be prepared to handle casinos doing larger deposits, but not handling the processing of individual payments to people betting at the casino. To handle the casino's overall accounts. But understand that your sales team are looking for ways to strengthen that relationship. So the decision that you made 3 months ago will get re-examined several months in the future, and you better be prepared to have that discussion. Last thing that you want to say at a strategy session, end of the fiscal year, or the beginning of a new fiscal year, is, oh, well, we're not prepared to handle that. And then somebody in a very senior position is going to say, well, we need you to get ready to handle it. Then you're scrambling to adapt to new solutions, because you're not only taking on brick and mortar casinos as clients, but you're going to expand your business to the sports betting firms that they're allowing to operate within their facility. So always be thinking forward about where the industry is going. Understanding the operational environment. What do we mean by this? This includes not only your industry, your client base, but what's going on in the larger industry, whether it's the gaming industry and the financial industry, and what's going on in the economy. And this is critically important because this is how your regulators will treat you. And if you wind up having to do a voluntary disclosure or somebody issues a subpoena, that's the way that they're going to treat you. You need to respond appropriately. Expectations and compliance continue to rise. You need to understand that it's not 25 years ago. There's very low tolerance for mistakes. As inflation continues to rise, there's going to be limited sympathy out there in the public for large companies that are becoming successful. Folks in the gaming industry should be aware of this. For my colleagues in the financial industry, as we look through the pandemic, retail trade, retail or commercial sales in the restaurant industry, retail clothing, and the hospitality industry and travel industry all saw massive loss because of restrictions that were placed on individuals during the pandemic. However, the cannabis industry, virtual currency, and gaming were some of those industries where we saw tremendous growth. So if there is a finding, if there is a subpoena, if there is an article in the news that says such and such institution was unaware of money laundering that was being done by the Sinaloa cartel via sports betting or via a casino, there's going to be limited sympathy out there. It's just like there's going to be limited sympathy for failure to recognize evasion of Russian sanctions going through your institution. The regulators in a number of jurisdictions around the world have put out significant guidance over the last 6 months. That's a warning that if you make a mistake, the expectation was that you were staying abreast of this and you were asking questions. Now that you've made a mistake, there's going to be very little sympathy and the penalties are going to be more severe. And the reputational risk is as we're talking about this, people in the financial industry need to understand we're dealing with multiple jurisdictions. We're dealing with multiple regulators. The gaming industry has its own regulators. The payment service providers have their own regulators. The internet and telecommunications services have their own regulators. And the financial industry has its own regulators. So stop saying the regulator and start explaining, hey, the Colorado Gaming Commission, the Arizona Gaming Commission, the New Jersey State Police Office of Gaming, FinCEN or FinTrack, or the FCA in the United Kingdom, or the EU has stated this. We already addressed crime follows commerce. So as we move into this field where there's tremendous opportunity because revenue is increasing and it looks like it will continue to grow despite some of the economic problems we see around, you've got to understand that the expectations from law enforcement, justice departments, prosecutorial authorities, and regulators. Two massive developments in North America specifically. In Canada, Bill C-218 was passed in June 2021. In the United States, in 2018, the Supreme Court overturned the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, which had effectively banned or severely limited single event sports betting. By overturning that act, the Supreme Court gave that decision back to each individual state, like we see with a number of things in cannabis, and even more recently in the United States with individual decisions on abortion. The reason why I highlight amateur in red is there's a tendency to really look at professional sports teams when we talk about gaming in the US. But you've got to understand that American college football and American basketball are incredibly popular, particularly the NCAA basketball, which occurs in the spring of every year. There are billions of dollars of revenue being generated in following the NCAA tournament. It goes on for several weeks, from late March into May. And the March Madness keeps creeping closer and closer to February. So you've got something like 6 to 8 weeks of fascination with what's going on in college basketball. That's going to attract a lot of sports betting as we go forward. And you better be prepared to deal with it. If you're not currently looking at the United States market, this will give you a sense of it. 20 states have allowed online wagers, and 6 others have legalized the practice, but not launched legalized sports betting. The reason I put the dates in there is these things are getting changed all the time, and they're occurring at a state level. So the requirements for staying abreast of all of these changes regarding what's going on, it's not just at the national level of Canada, England, Poland, or the United States. It's 50 states across the United States. It's every province across Canada in individual territories. What we're also seeing at the same time is an increasing use of online betting sites, betting apps, and the growing acceptance of virtual currency, both in placing bets and in receiving wins. We've got to come to grips with not only an evolving landscape in the gaming industry, but an evolving legal framework with respect to virtual currency and virtual assets. And that makes everything that much more complicated. If you're not aware of it, there's increasing participation of formal sports leagues in North America, partnering with different betting associations. So that just puts more emphasis behind the league, greater marketing to a larger audience. And what it means in very concrete terms is commercials that you're going to see while sports are going on, in different promotions that are going on during actual events. One of the things that really triggered my awareness of looking at this was when the NHL signed an agreement with DraftKings. Coming from a Canadian bank, although I sit in the United States, I knew that we had risk here. And to believe that the United States, although we hadn't seen significant activity in single event sports betting at the time that DraftKings signed the agreement with the NHL, you have to know that it's coming, and that people in border states or with a VPN hider are going to place bets in Canada if that's the way that they want to bet on the New York Rangers or the Las Vegas Golden Knights. What you also need to understand is there's a massive online gaming market for sports betting in the United States. If you haven't looked at this already, I would encourage you to get on Google and just type in Indonesian betting sites, and you'll be amazed at what you can bet on outside of Indonesia. You can bet on NHL games. You can bet on NFL football games. You can bet on NBA and USPL games in the United States. There's that much interest, there's that much revenue following. So for folks that aren't aware of this, I'm going to highlight an example of Playtech. When you get the slides in the comments section, you'll see a link to an article that's done in the Wall Street Journal. There's a video that accompanies it that's about 6 minutes long. Playtech is a company that's located in Michigan, in the central northern part of the United States, borders Canada. And it's a virtual or completely online casino. This young woman that you see running the roulette table, she's being recorded in a studio. All the bettors are operating online. They're just watching this young woman spin the roulette wheel. Now, some people might say, oh, well, that's an online betting firm, so we don't feel comfortable taking on that kind of client yet. We're only going to deal with brick and mortar institutions. What you got to understand is, particularly during the pandemic, Playtech picked up a number of brick and mortar casinos because people weren't able to actually physically travel to casinos because they were shut down. So Bally's, for example, or Mangine's Casino, which could be located somewhere in Michigan, can't bring lots of clients in. But what I can do is open up space for Playtech, where I've got people logging in either to my casino site and then Playtech is available, or I work out some deal where I own a certain portion of clients that are betting with Playtech. If you don't recognize that this phenomenon or this particular part of the industry exists, you're not going to be looking at any sort of AML fraud or compliance risk associated. Playtech is not the only company out there. There are numerous companies out there around the world doing this at brick and mortar institutions around the world. Now that you know that it exists, you can start doing the risk analysis that's necessary. So we'll talk about risk consideration. I'm going to borrow this quote from a colleague of mine who works in due diligence with virtual currency. And he loves to start off every briefing by saying, regardless of whether you hold Bitcoin, Ether, Litecoin, or Monero at your financial institution, you are exposed to virtual currency, regardless of whether you bank in a virtual currency exchange. How could you be exposed? Your individual clients might run a virtual currency exchange and bank or use a payment service provider to get that cash. But at the end of the day, the end of the week, the end of the month, or the end of the year, they're taking profit that they generate from that exchange or from individual trades and depositing it with your institution. The risk is significantly smaller if you're in the United States, but depending on where they conduct that business and how they do it, that risk could be significantly higher, where you have a due diligence obligation to understand what they're doing and from where they're collecting revenue. So to all my colleagues in the financial industry, when we talk about sports betting, my remark is you need to start thinking in terms of how am I exposed? How is my institution or firm exposed? As opposed to, do we have any exposure or are we exposed at all? So the way that I take Mike's comment and I bring it into the sports betting is, just because you don't have a casino or sports betting firm as a client doesn't mean that you have exposure to this industry, to casinos particularly, or sports betting particularly, or even online sports. The thing that you need to think about at this point is, how would you even recognize whether you have exposure? If you have a certain firm that's doing online sports betting, it should be fairly obvious from your KYC process. But if you've got a payment service provider that is providing support to payment applications or online sports betting, that should also be coming up in your KYC and in your annual KYC review. Your client questionnaires about the industries that they support should include a discussion of, do you work in certain jurisdictions in the world? Do you have a compliance program? Do you have a sanctions compliance program? What does it look like? Do you handle any businesses in the cannabis industry? Do you handle any businesses in the streaming online adult content industry? And do you handle anything in the online gaming industry? And if they respond yes to any one of those, you have a more nuanced conversation with your client about how they're handling the very unique cybersecurity, AML, and fraud risks based on the industries that they're supporting. If it's just a client that, like Tom Mangine, owns an individual savings account, the way that you recognize this is by looking at deposits and seeing, does my deposit and withdrawal activity match what I'm saying my income is? My pay statements that I submitted when I took out a mortgage or when I first opened this said that my annual income broke down to a monthly income of 5,000 US dollars. Well, why are you seeing irregular deposits in the range of 500 to 5,500 US dollars a couple of weeks in disparate months? And it's having that sort of follow-up conversation of, well, where's this additional income coming from? Oh, well, I'm very good on FanDuel or DraftKings because I understand how to place bets on the NHL, or I have a very good understanding of handicapping from Hong Kong racing. You're betting on, horseback, on horse racing in Hong Kong or dog racing in some part. That might lead to another risk assessment and risk analysis. As we talk about risk, I'll bring up something that affected my thought process as I was looking at this presentation. When I was at the SBC Gaming Conference in Barcelona, I attended a number of compliance briefings. One of them, unfortunately, was dominated and derailed by a number of participants arguing whether the gaming industry should be considered high risk or more medium risk or low risk. The sports gaming, the sports betting and the gaming industry overall is more complex. It's like cannabis and virtual currency. From a financial industry perspective, that's the way that you should look at it. And the reason why I say that is threefold. One, in some jurisdictions in the world, it's completely outlawed. It's unlike selling clothing or selling blue jeans. Selling blue jeans from certain countries might be banned, but the concept of selling denim clothing or selling jeans isn't really banned in any part of it. When you talk about gaming or cannabis or virtual currency, that activity is banned or severely limited. In the People's Republic of China prior to 2021, individual Chinese citizens were prohibited from owning virtual currency, but they could certainly mine it. They couldn't trade it. And then what you saw in May of 2021 is the Chinese government decided even allowing that support to the mining industry. The other pillar why it's a little bit more complex is it's not always at a national level, as you see in Canada and the United States. It's handled at a subnational level. So what is legal in Ontario may not necessarily be legal in British Columbia. What is permitted in Nevada is certainly not the same thing as what's permitted in Utah, as permitted in Florida, or in Nevada. And the last thing is there's just some traditional bias with which you are going to have to address these issues. Don't ignore it. Just understand it as you move forward. If you decide to take these industries on, or certain elements of these industries, understand that there's unique risks here. In Canada and the United States, we haven't dealt with single event sports betting for decades. So you've got to start getting a very clear understanding of what's going on in the legal framework, because that legal framework, as we addressed 10 minutes ago, continues to evolve at almost a monthly rate. You're seeing significant changes in the industry. And as the industry continues to grow in Canada, you'll probably see a lot of significant changes in the law to prohibit certain actions that are associated with higher risk or potentially illegal activity, or to open up the industry to facilitate growth and greater participation. When you think about your strategy and the risk considerations going forward, you need to consider not just the regulators, but the criminals. It's really important, because I still work for a financial institution, that I'm not creating any sort of equivalence or tying any sort of equivalence between a regulatory authority and a criminal organization, particularly a transnational criminal organization. I'm saying you're both out there. Regulators are going to set standards and provide guidance for you. They are going to be meeting with you probably annually, if not more frequently. They have the authority to look at everything that you're doing, to analyze your policy, and issue guidance accordingly, specifically to you. Failure to comply results in some of the most immediate action that has a long-term effect because you have a regular relationship with this regulator. But what I have seen both in the financial industry and in other industries is people forgetting that there are criminals out there. They are real, living, breathing adversaries that are working against you every day. They're looking for ways to exploit your individual firm, whether it's my bank, somebody's online sports betting company, or somebody's casino somewhere in Ontario. They are attempting to exploit your business, either directly targeting the business itself or indirectly leveraging your services to launder their proceeds of crime, engaging you in money laundering. One thing that I'll bring up specifically to folks in the financial industry, and this is similar to when you're working with companies that work in armaments or dual use technology. The gaming industry, the cannabis industry, the aviation industry, or dual use technology companies have their own compliance team. They have very specific knowledge about the risk unique to their industry, and they often receive quality training that's hard for you to stay abreast of because you're looking at so many different things in the financial industry at one time. That's a resource. Build effective partnerships with your client. Talk to them about what's going on in their compliance program and express your concerns and have them express the way that they're addressing those concerns to you. That's a critical part of your continuous know your customer, know your customer's customer, and evaluate your customer process. These people bring tremendous knowledge, often in the form of folks that have been working in the industry for 15 to 20 years, sometimes on different continents, people that have come from law enforcement agencies, prosecutorial authorities that were specifically dedicated to the gaming industry. So if you're not doing that, you're leaving information or intelligence on the table. When you think about more concrete risk considerations, you break it down into a couple of different areas. First, you have your legal risk and your reputational risk. Everybody understands the legal risk. It's important for people to understand what you consider your legal obligation. If you're a Canadian bank and it turns out there's somebody betting from another jurisdiction and they're not reporting their income to their tax authority, or you don't know whether they're reporting that income to the tax authority, how are you going to approach that challenge? If that person is betting through your institution or collecting money through your institution in Finland and they're not reporting it to the tax authority, probably handle it the same way that you would any other Finnish company. And when you see activity going to them, if you notice something unusual going on, you report it. When you look at your reputational risk, how do you measure this compared to everything else that's going on within your institution? As you take on riskier enterprises, how do you think your board of directors will handle this? How do you think your client base will handle this? How do you think this is going to play in the larger public opinion about you? And how are your regulators if you suddenly enter into the virtual asset space, the cannabis space, and the gaming space globally, all within 6 months? One of the questions that regulators might ask is, have you done adequate preparation to make sure that everyone understands what the risks look like and how to appropriately handle them? When you're looking at individual risks from a compliance perspective, the way that we organize it is by looking at AML, fraud, and cyber concerns. They're all subtly different. As you play out the different ways that AML fraud and cyber risks will appear with brick and mortar casinos, online casinos, casinos or gaming companies that are using online payment applications and third service providers, it can look pretty overwhelming. But don't think of the gaming industry or sports betting as being any different from any industry that you bring on. No set of controls that you put forward is going to be foolproof. No set of controls that a client in sports betting is going to put forward is foolproof. The critical thing is understanding where the more severe risks are and focusing on those so that your risk-based approach makes sense and isn't taking undue risk or being overly optimistic. One thing that I will highlight for people in the financial industry, if you're not familiar with it, identifying problems to prevent gambling addiction, or problem betting as it's called in some parts, has been a significant focus of the gaming industry for what I would say last 5 or 10 years. It's something that we'll talk frequently about when they talk about their compliance program. So it's important that you recognize it as a larger element of this, and it'll certainly be something that addresses your reputational risk concern. So when you're looking at fraud, it breaks down to people targeting the bettor, the individual client of the sports betting firm and casino, targeting the sports betting firm or service, and targeting a third-party payment provider, like a payment service provider or a financial institution that's supporting. The cyber risks are going to be somewhat the same. And it's important that your conversations about risk, whether you're a fraud person, an AML person, a compliance person, start including those conversations about cybersecurity and cyber risk, because there's going to be a lot of confluence where you see cyber-enabled financial crime. So cyber risks are going to focus on targeting the bettor, targeting the sports betting firm or the service, and targeting any third-party service providers, looking for larger exploitation like a business email compromise or spear phishing and whale phishing. When you look at your own compliance program, clients that you bring on that are sports betting firms, or you allow a lot of your clients to do direct deposits to accounts with sports betting firms or receive payments from sports betting firms, that's the way that you should organize your approach to assessing the risk. And the reason why I highlight AML in red is because it's significantly different. Money launderers are looking to exploit the large flow of cash moving back and forth within sports betting firms and casinos in the gaming industry. The money launderer isn't looking to really steal Tom Mangine's money, not looking to steal from Mangine's casino in Michigan. What it's looking to do is hide all of their illicit money in the flow of all the money from legitimate clients of Mangine's casino in Michigan. So it's different. And when you look at a lot of compliance programs from sports betting firms, casinos, or companies in the gaming industry, they're very upfront in addressing fraud risks, particularly identity theft, synthetic identity fraud, or people attempting to defraud the company, the sports betting firm, or the casino. Make sure you're having those conversations about AML risks and what they can and cannot address. Now, what we said in the previous slide is they're going to have their own compliance program at a sports betting firm. Make sure that if their program is a little bit weaker, your program at the financial institution or the non-banking financial institution pick up that slack and balance out the overall risk. You'll not only see exploitation of the firm or casino, and that's laundering money through the casino. You'll see corruption within the firm or the casino. If you're not familiar with what I'm talking about there, that's people at the casino turning a blind eye to money laundering activity and profiting from it. If you're not familiar with that, take a look at the case of Star Casino, Star Entertainment Group in Australia, where there were a number of compliance failures and money laundering failures related to people gambling from China. And as a result, there were numerous individuals and organizations from the People's Republic of China that were able to launder millions through the Star Gaming Entertainment Group. That investigation is ongoing. The Star Entertainment Group has already lost some licenses within territories. I think they've lost their license already within Queensland, and it's under review in a couple of other portions of Australia. And the last one is tracking corruption in sport. This is match fixing, point shaving. This is a more complicated issue. It's one that's not going to appear on a lot of the high priority lists for financial institutions or even casinos. But corruption in sports is a massive industry. And that massive industry feeds other activity to include fraud and money laundering within the gaming industry. The ability of the gaming industry and the financial industry support sports integrity, Ministry of Sports, and law enforcement and ministries of justice in this fight helps support the overall effort of keeping sports clean and keeping sports. So what are some things that you should take away from this? Not all sports betting firms are alike. Hopefully I've stressed that enough. It's not only what they do in the industry, where they do it, and how they do it. Do they do it through a phone? Do you have your own identity? Do you own multiple accounts? Do you place everything through the application? Or do you have an identity on their website that is maintained by them that you set up online and then you can access through a phone app, but you can't set it up with a phone? Is it a brick and mortar casino? Is it a brick and mortar casino that offers space to a sports betting firm to operate single event sports betting, and the brick and mortar casino receives a portion of their earnings? So when you think about operations, think about what they do in significant detail. It's not just that you're in the gaming industry. What part of the gaming industry are you? Are you online? Are you brick and mortar? Are you both? What specifically do you do in that space? What sports are you active in? Do you solely support, if you're a sports betting firm in Canada, do you allow bets on leagues in the United States? Do you allow bets on the NFL where there are no Canadian franchises? Do you allow bets on the NCAA? Do you allow bets on the KHL, the mostly Russian hockey? I think there's 7 nations. Do you allow sports betting on UEFA? Do you allow sports betting on the Argentine or the Brazilian soccer leagues? When you talk about jurisdictions, how are you verifying this? You can say that you only operate in Canada and that your clients are all Canadian. Well, we ask them to submit an actual email address, or we ask them to submit some form of photo ID. How are you confirming that that photo ID is in fact correct and it's not a synthetic fake or deep fake? Are you verifying IP address activity in some way to ensure that there isn't somebody in the UAE or in Indonesia or in South America moving thousands of dollars through your firm or your financial institution like that? When you look at individual services, you'll get to this in a little bit, but some of these are red flags. Do they offer some sort of junket or equivalent of a junket, like a customer reward or loyalty plan? If they are offering it, what compliance or due diligence measures do they have in place to make sure that someone isn't exploiting that from a money laundering perspective, that they're not leveraging that in order to commit fraud or conduct money laundering? How many accounts can one client hold? There's a number of very popular betting sites out there, online betting sites in North America, that will allow you to hold anywhere from 3 to 10 accounts. Tom Mangine can have Mangine 1 through 7. Are you adequately tracking that activity for something that would resemble watch trading if we were talking about trading on a stock market or dealing in currency exchange? Because that would be indicative of money laundering. Some people might say it's just hedging your bet. Well, am I always doing that? How much money am I walking away with? You might want to look at how many accounts Mr. Mangine is operating at your institution, how much money is moving through them, and have a conversation about how do we know that this is money laundering? How long can funds remain in one account? Can I have $10,000 sitting in an online account for 6 months, 12 months, over 12 months? Does it go inactive at some point? Or can I just say, oh, I was betting during the NCAA tournament, and I'm only going to come back as we start getting into January of next year, February of next year. I'll bet on the football, I'll bet on the NFL playoffs and Super Bowl, and then I'll go straight into March Madness. Or because I've been dormant, my account has been dormant for 30, 60, 179, or let's say 365 days. Do I need to do some new due diligence? And does my IP address and the trusted device that I was using and my identity need to match up with what I previously submitted? And if it's not, is additional identity verification required? When you look at your own compliance program, the compliance program of a sports betting firm, some questions that you should think about is, what exactly does the KYC program require? All you need to really have a compliance program is something that documents a procedure. What kind of information are they collecting? Are they verifying? How are they verifying? How often are they verifying or updating that information? What's the focus of the compliance program? Now, that sometimes is a rather straightforward question. Sometimes you just look at the questions that they're asking. Oh, well, we're looking at what our regulator requires us to do. That's great. If you're a sports betting firm that's working with a financial institution, you need to understand I've got my own regulator who's asking me different questions. So we're going to have to address those questions together. I'd like you to work with me either by assuring me that you're getting some of that information or making some of that information available to me or explaining to me exactly what you're doing and what you're not doing so I know what my people need to do. It's not going to be A, B, or C, one of those top three choices. I would submit it's going to be letter D, a combination of those where we're working together to effectively meet all the requirements, not only of the regulators, but to address criminals that might exploit either one of our firms. One of the most important things I say is you have a compliance program. That's great. You probably wrote this document 1 to 2 years ago. As we've seen, this industry is growing and changing in ways that some people can't anticipate. So you need to have that sort of continuous training program. Does your training program ask the same 10 questions? Or does that training program actually stress people and introduce new speakers, new concepts, new ideas, require people to learn new issues and introduce new questions into your processes? Who's responsible for administering and updating it? Are you engaging a third party? How are you briefing that third party based on what you want? Are you bringing in your regulator to talk? Bringing in appropriate prosecutorial or law enforcement authorities? Understanding that a lot of sports betting firms, particularly online firms, are going to be leaner operations. So where are you reaching out to get help? Are you using due diligence firms? Are you using sports integrity firms? Do you understand what we mean when we say sports betting compliance or sports integrity firms like Sport Wizard? How are you getting cybersecurity support? And how are you marrying up what your cybersecurity teams are seeing with what your AML and fraud teams are seeing? Do you have somebody out there monitoring the dark web for anybody reporting on your particular firm? And how are you sharing that information with the dark web monitoring activity that the financial institution or payment service providers that you're using are doing their dark web activity? The last comment ties into cybersecurity and determining jurisdictions. How are you determining digital identities and footprints? You say that we're getting people signed on to trusted devices, trusted users. And that's great from the sense of engaging employees and helping fight fraud. But do you understand how people might be leveraging things like VPN Sharp to hide their true IP address? Maybe because they're involved in criminal activity, or maybe they're just involved in sort of what I'll call low-level criminal activity. Are they somebody living in Europe that wants access to betting sites in North America, as well as access to Netflix? Because you get to see additional programs that they don't offer on Netflix. And if you're not aware of that, Netflix packages in different parts of the world, different streaming services offer different programs. So what you'll see with a lot of expatriates is they get some sort of other IP address service. How are you confirming this? If you were to look at a lot of my remote activity from where I work, I live in Illinois, but I work for a Canadian bank, the Bank of Montreal. A lot of my IP address activity on my work laptop, when I'm in my home in the suburbs of Chicago, is a Canadian IP address. And that can be critically important to identifying illicit activity. So another slide to break up a lot of the verbiage. What I want you to look at from a North American perspective and take a look at what you have in these provinces of Canada and what you have in these states of the United States. See how many of these jurisdictions betting is legal in border territories. Now, that being said, how many people might be tempted to place bets in other jurisdictions, whether it's legal or not legal? So when you take a look at Saskatchewan, and that graphic might be a little bit outdated, or Minnesota in the United States, Well, I can't legally bet in Minnesota, but I'm not that far away from Manitoba or Alberta. Can I bet there? What's legal in the Dakotas as opposed to what's legal in Alberta? What's legal in Ontario, what's permitted in Ontario, versus what's permitted in small towns in New York? And what's a way that I can get cross border easily enough? So, as we talk about all these considerations, we'll now move to thinking about your overall strategy for approaching this. When I talked about think and then act, this is the last phase of the think piece, and where you start laying out how you're going to act. Think about what segment or segments of the industry in which you will operate. Are you only going to take on brick and mortar casinos? Are you going to be willing to handle payments for brick and mortar casinos that open up certain services to online betting? And under what conditions will you do that? Will you operate in multiple geographic jurisdictions? And which ones? Will you allow certain online gaming providers? Are they going to be ones that exclusively operate in your country, or let's say in the United States and Canada, and don't offer services outside these territories? Are you going to be willing to take on some online betting organizations that are global, have a global footprint? Are you going to be working with organizations that are smaller or are larger and have more robust compliance programs? Identify those folks in your firm that already understand the law. I can't say that enough. If your compliance team doesn't have attorneys that are well versed in it, you need to get them read up on it, and you need to start considering some of those third-party firms with whom you will consult to get informed as to what is legal, what's not legal, and what's in discussion, and how to stay abreast about changes in the law, because this is rapidly evolving. When we talk about the threat, think about organizations such as this. This particular association, the Association of Certified Anti-Money Laundering Specialists, the Association of Certified Crime Specialists, the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. Think about the webinars that this association is making available. Think about what your regulatory authority, what kind of papers they're putting out there, what universities are engaged with. My colleagues in the financial industry, there are institutions like the University of New Haven, which is really focused a lot on just investigations overall, investigative method and process. But they've got a number of certificates and a number of select courses that people can take that are focused on financial crime and certain financial crime typologies, or certain financial crime activities in support of certain criminal networks, whether it be human trafficking, wildlife trafficking, or illicit activity in gaming. And it might be worthwhile sending a couple of people through such an organization program, taking those best ideas and lessons learned, and having those people do what we used to call in the military, train the training. We didn't have the resources always to send somebody off to scuba school or to scout swimmer school or to sniper school. You brought those people back. You'd send one or two of your best people out there. Folks, you knew that we're going to graduate. And then they would come back and say, hey, these are the things that I think are appropriate to the larger organization. And they would develop your own smaller training program and then administer it with those other people that had the appropriate training. So developing that training plan is critical. When you understand the law and you recognize what the threats that you face are, based on where you've decided to operate in the space, you can start to construct typologies. And most importantly, think about how those typologies are going to appear on your spreadsheets and on your screen. How is your AML investigator or fraud investigator going to see this? How is the person who's working in payment operations going to see this activity? And how do you work with whatever monitoring system that you have, or AI and machine learning, to start generating the appropriate? Once you've done that, think about your overall training program. You've got these core people that have either the existing skill set or at least the attitude and the aptitude to gain those skills and teach everybody else. Start fleshing out a training program for getting people the information and the experience that they need. If you don't have a training budget, just start thinking about all the places where you can go get free information. And I recommend you do that even if you have a training. Think about where you can get the most bang for your buck because everything's only getting more expensive. So you've got to be a good steward of your money. Think about free webinars such as this, where you can professionally network with people, where you can download papers from FATF or the United Nations, even as they look at integrity in sport and criminal exploitation of sports. Don't just rely on internal sources or your usual sources. So as a financial industry person, it shouldn't be me just going to ACAMS and CFCS. It should be me reaching out to organizations such as this one and talking to guys like Ian Messenger, looking at what the University of New Haven or the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, which has a specific gaming regulatory center and publishes a lot of papers. Take a look at what people are already doing in Europe. If you're in Great Britain, you've already thought about single event sports betting, compliance betting, much more because you've been doing it for a longer time and you've been allowed to do it in North America, Canada, and the United States. See what they're doing in other countries, what they're doing in Asia, what they're doing to regulate some of these gaming firms that might be in Southeast Asia, or some of these ones that are operating in the EU and registered the island, and leverage their lessons learned. Don't be afraid to reach out to people, whether it's people in this industry or have those effective conversations with your clients. I can say this as one of the people that was part of my bank's team that was doing the initial assessment and early vetting of clients in the cannabis industry. In 2019, I found myself back in Colombia meeting with Canadian Colombian firms that wanted to export cannabis and cannabis products to Canada and going through the audit process. And it's not just conversation with ACAMS. It wasn't just conversations with FinCEN in the United States. It was also conversations with people I knew in the DEA and talking with authorities and regulators in Colombia and people that were in the cannabis space at state levels in the United States, cannabis space in different countries around the world where it had been legal longer to talk about how they brought it forward. There's no monopoly on great ideas. So feel free to go see what other people are doing. You may not adopt what they are doing, but it might spur your own thought in a different direction. So as you go forward, build your typologies and your list of red flags as they're going to appear on your people's screens. I can't say that enough. I highly recommend you develop your own specific KYC review questionnaires for folks in the gaming industry, for sports betting firms, that talk about things about what activities they're doing, how they ensure they're doing these activities, what jurisdictions in the world that they're operating, what sort of third-party due diligence, security, or payment providers that they're using, how they're training their people. Not only so that you know it from a compliance perspective, but it'll spur your own ideas about folks with whom you should engage. Leverage your AI and money laundering wherever possible. As we talk about certain techniques for money laundering, it'll be critically important. Take a look at where you can get external support. And this is critical to my job. It's one of the reasons why I have a job in the private sector, public sector, private sector engagement. Don't just stumble into it and don't wait for an association to do it for you. Think about a plan of how you will engage regulators, law enforcement authorities, prosecutorial authorities, and your peers in the industry. And start off with who knows other folks that can make that first introduction and ask about what they have available. Think about what information you might be able to share in a briefing. You can always find a lot of people to attend a briefing, but sometimes you can't find anybody who's willing to just say something up there. But I can tell you, as a person who worked in the public sector in the United States and has helped stand up public sector, private sector engagement plans on behalf of the US government, different parts of the world, and on behalf of my bank in different public sector appreciates hearing your feedback. They don't really know in many cases what goes on in your institution. Law enforcement officials tend to join law enforcement when they're very young. They tend to join the military or the Justice Department when they're very young. And they might not have any experience. They'd love to get your perspective about what keeps you up at night and what you see is very difficult and what actually it looks like when data comes across your screen. You can say whatever you want about recognizing unusual activity. One of the most important things to take away from that conversation is if you don't know what normal looks like, you'll never know what abnormal looks like. If you can't recognize usual, you don't recognize unusual. How do I understand what's usual? Start thinking about what your clients are doing with their clients or counterparty. Based on the jurisdiction, their particular services that they offer, the products that they offer, and the element of the larger industry, a subsector in that industry in which they operate. So as you look at this, careful consideration of what you do and how you'll do it is essential. Make sure when you say, oh, we don't have exposure to that. Are you sure? How are you checking that? Okay. And I think this becomes a great tool for engaging employees at any one of your firms. You get employees motivated by having them look at things, bring things back. And then it becomes a great tool for professional development and also management, because you could say, Johnny did a great job with that one. Steve, not so much. We should really be considering Johnny for either a bonus or promotion. And the more that you do that, you'll see more employees who are looking for greater opportunities start reaching out about what we can do. Build in-house compliance programs. Build your own capability in-house. Even if it's just the one go-to person. Who are the people that are going to be handling this particular or complex industry? Is it a collection of individual employees? As a compliance person, don't just think compliance. How are they talking with your attorneys, and how are they talking with the sales team about what's going on? This becomes critically important for your credibility in the long run. The more that you can express what is a concern from a risk perspective to your sales team, the more responsive that they'll be, because you're letting them know, look, this is a green light. If you're dealing with a client who wants to do this, that's okay, we can handle that. If you're dealing with something here, that's a red light. You don't want to handle that one. Here's an amber light or a yellow light. Reach out to us and engage us early so we can have a conversation about how we mitigate the associated risk. Or we can let you know early on, we're not ready to do that. And that saves a salesperson so much aggravation that you win loyalty and cooperation going forward. Something for everyone to remember is, look, criminals aren't taking the day off. It's a great day to bring this up because it's a holiday in my country and in my boss's country. So crime's not taking a day off, act accordingly. Okay, you need to be on top of your game. When you think about critical things that we need to look at, here's some of the more specific items. Is there a digital KYC effort? Specifically, how are we identifying devices? How are we identifying IP addresses? How are we verifying that identity documents are legitimate? How are we making sure that critical IP addresses and device characteristics, fingerprints, which is actually the name of a company in the United Kingdom that looks at trusted devices and tries to get a digital fingerprint. How are they verifying that device over time? If you're a financial institution, is your client even considering this? How are they looking? If your KYC process is looking at digitally submitted IDs, how are you as a financial institution looking at it? Especially if you're getting a ID with which you're not normally accustomed. Are you looking for passports? Are you looking for driver's license? Would you recognize an American driver's license? Would you recognize an American military ID card? Or Department of Defense ID card? That's a legal form of identification, but it doesn't have address information. I can tell you the Department of Defense wouldn't be happy with employees using that as their form of identification online. If you see a cedula, which is a national identity card in a number of parts of Spanish-speaking world, would you understand what it's supposed to look like? If you've got somebody who's a legal Canadian resident, but was born and raised in Belarus, and they're using their Belarusian passport, would you recognize what is a legitimate Belarusian or Taiwanese passport as opposed to a very weak forgery? Where are you getting help to do that? Talked about money laundering being a greater concern, particularly for me in financial institutions, because I'm somebody who sits in AML. When you think about the typologies and the techniques that you'll see in betting, it's going to look a lot like wash trades or currency exchanges, where you're losing intentionally. If bettors can hold multiple accounts, can they place multiple bets? And how is something that would look like a wash trade going to look here? And bettors place directly against, place bets directly against each other. Can I use your service to bet against my good friend Ian or my friend John? And I just consistently lose $1,000 to Ian every few weeks. Well, are we sure that's just Tom not being able to bet and recognize that he shouldn't be betting against Ian? Or that's actually money laundering activity? When we talk about junkets or loyalty programs, what are the measures to track such activity? And what are we using to make sure that certain people aren't offering some of these services or some of the loyalty programs to other people? If you don't understand how junkets work, there's some great case studies that you can pull up that have been pulled apart by different journalists, by organizations like the Financial Action Task Force, University of Nevada, Las Vegas. But it's basically a tried and true technique in the brick and mortar casino world for Asian triads to collect up junkets and loyalty and rewards programs by having a number of people that they'll hire for $50 or $250 a piece to sign up, get the reward points, and then funnel that or offer that to the criminal organization, which uses it to pay the losses that they would encounter as they launder money. The swarming technique, if you're not familiar with it, it's kind of an archaic term. It came up from about 20 years ago when I was with the Department of Defense. It looks a lot like placement and layering. It's a large transnational organization or a larger terrorist group hiring a couple of people to set up fake or false accounts. And then each person is responsible for moving very small denominations of money, usually somewhere between $400 and $900, or $400, $900 of whatever currency. But if the organization has 5 people that each recruit 10 people to do this, and those 10 people set up 10 fake accounts, you can move a lot of money through the day. It's critical, to consider what you can use in terms of AI and machine learning. It becomes very helpful. I can tell you, I've done this by looking at Excel spreadsheets. It's critical to look at the jurisdictions, look at the betting activity, and take a look at when these payments are popping up. If you're a sports betting firm, you'll see that there's long periods of dormancy in these accounts where they're just waiting to get that next, amount of money that they need to launder through your service. And then after they win, the funds rapidly move out, and they're, maintaining the minimum level amount of money or doing the minimum activity to keep the account active. You may not see them even sign on to the account for 30, 40, or even 180 days. The denominations, again, are very small, 3 to 4 figures, and you'll see similarities in these accounts on the same day. As a financial institution, what you'll see is a large series of payments in these numbers going to one account. So you'll see 5 or 6 accounts, each moving 3 to 4 figures to one account, usually an overseas account in East Asia or West Africa. And you'll start to notice that everybody has the same sort of name. They're sort of foreign equivalents of John Smith or Tom Jones. And that if you do research looking back at transactions, that Mr. Jones seems to have this kind of activity where he's sending money out to this particular bank account, to this particular firm, or this particular counterparty overseas every couple of months, and it's the same denomination. You got to start asking yourself, how many other people are doing that in the same 24 to 48-hour time span? If you look at all of those such transactions, that's when you see a real pattern emerge. I can tell you from personal experience, having your computer do that for you as opposed to doing that manually on Excel is infinitely easier and far more effective, and it's much safer on your eyes. As you go to the gaming industry, this will be my last couple of comments. What I will tell you, as you engage with the financial sector, just understand they've got their own regulators, and they take their regulators are placing certain requirements on them. What are those? Because those are the things that are really going to concern them. That's the thing that they've got to answer every year or every year. Those are the questions that they're going to come to you. The more capable you are at discussing things in terms that they understand, the more effective engagement you'll have with them, and the less frustration, and it helps your sales team sell you as a good client in space. It gets you more services and greater support. Think about the data that you're taking in. What data do you have on your client? How are you verifying this data? What data does your bank and your service provider have? Can you share that data? Understand that you might not be able to share that data. You might not be able to share their data with them. But the simple fact of explaining, this is the data that we collect, can be critically important, because some people at larger financial institutions are going to meet with you today. Tomorrow, they're going to meet with a correspondent bank in Austria to talk about how they're complying with US, Canadian, British, and EU sanctions against Russia. And the day after that, they're going to meet with a ceramic molding firm to make sure that they're complying with dual-use export technology control. All right. So the more that you can explain what you're doing to them, you're educating them, and you'll have a more effective engagement. Don't be afraid to reach out and ask these questions. I handle these meetings regularly for my bank, where I meet not only with our correspondent partners, but our more complex clients. How do we collect data? How do we conduct training? There might be some good ideas out there. How do we conduct AML training? We might have more experience than your firm because we are a larger entity. Don't be afraid to draft off some of our experience. Offer the idea of joint training. I would be more than enthusiastic when any client goes, I've got a guy here who could run a webinar session. We could have a Q&A session and ask some very good questions. That would be incredibly rewarding, not only for everyone involved, but our larger departments and the relationships between firms. Think about what other firms out there could provide support to you. Beneficial ownership in high-risk jurisdictions where they are around the world. I understand as an online betting firm, you tend to be a little bit leaner than you are at an international bank. So you might not have as much experience dealing with firms in, certain parts of the Mediterranean or the Caribbean, or in South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, East Asia, or Eastern Europe. Great. Who do you know to whom you can reach out to get that support when you need it, or to make sure that your plans are effective? What are you doing for dark web? What are you looking for digital identification for? And lastly, sports integrity firms. Are you familiar with what firms like iGaming Academy or Fingerprint or Sports Lizard in the UK or their counterparts are doing out there in industry? Are you familiar with this association? Are you a paying member? Are you taking training here? Or are you just saying, I don't have the budget for it. I go to the free webinars when they're available, or we spend some money on it. We download the slides and we try and engage. We're building a public sector, private sector. I know I went over time. We started a little bit late. I apologize for that. I think, what can we give you for takeaways? I tried to balance this out in terms of what would be useful for people in the gaming industry and what would be useful for people in the financial industry. These are some places that have free resources, and then some of them have things behind a paywall. Some people have things that are completely free. FATF, FinCEN, and FinTrack represent regulatory and oversight authorities. For those of you don't know it, FATF does publish a number of things. They tend to be a little bit older and outdated. For people that aren't familiar with it, the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, from an outside the gaming industry perspective, I think they offered some of the most concrete material that's out there, outside what Ian makes available, for getting your foot in the door and getting oriented to this space. I highly encourage financial industries to think about this the way that you think about cannabis and the way that you think about virtual currency and virtual assets. It's not something with which you've always been familiar. You're going to have to do a lot of learning, particularly when it comes to esports and e-gaming. If you're not familiar with it, it's incredibly popular. I come from the generation that started off with Atari 2600 and then thought in television was sophisticated. There are people that could laugh at my parents if they were still with us and say, yeah, no, I'm earning a six-figure salary playing video games for a living in competition. If you don't think that there's betting going on there, there is. And if you don't think that criminals are exploiting it, launder money through there, or even compromise the integrity of the video game competition, they are. And there's a couple of great documents out there available on websites like these. So I haven't really been looking at the chat. If there are questions out there, feel free to ask them at this time. I defer to Ian as to when these slides will be available. You can see my name on the first slide. Feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. If you're a little too embarrassed to ask a question now, I completely understand that. Get back with me at another time, or feel free to reach out to me via email. And that, subject to your questions, comments, or opinions, this concludes my briefing. I really appreciate meeting all you guys today and you sharing your time.